Greetings, viewers. This is King Echu from Southern Cameroon, Ambazonia. Welcome to my channel. This is a Pan-African platform. Please like, share, and subscribe. I want to have a discussion about an article that I came across, and the title of this article is "Eto'o reacts to refusal by European clubs to release African players to represent their countries." Clubs in France, particularly, have voted unanimously against decisions by players to return home and play for their respective countries. As you know, the qualification for the African Nation Cup is going on, and so many of the African countries are calling for their best players that they did not help produce. They're calling for the best players to come back and represent in their native country's team. But clubs in France are refusing to let go of those players, and I think they are right to do so. You see, many of those players who are playing in those clubs in Europe developed their skills in those clubs in Europe. You know, those clubs have spent enough money to develop their football skills to the highest of the highest. They have made these players who they are. They have put in money and effort. They don't want to squander it to an African nation cup. The African nations, the African countries should develop their own players, but they don't. You see, many of the players who play in the European clubs, yes, they did get their start in games during the African Nation or the African Nation Cup or the World Cup in playing in their own countries. But by showing their skills so that the European club could acquire them, train them even more, put enough money, pay them well enough to play in their club. So it is reasonable, it's logically reasonable for the European clubs to deny those players, despite the fact that they are born in African countries or whatever, they still, could be refused. The clubs have the opportunity to say no to them to going to play in their country of origin. I mean, for me, it's a good thing because those clubs have actually put in the effort, put in the work, make those players who they are. They have developed those players. So by saying no to African nations who do not take the time, the patience, the effort, the financial resources in the African players, they don't do that because many of the clubs in Africa are not, you know, they're not up to standard where you know players could be selected to play in the nation. But not saying that those players who are playing in those clubs in Africa are not good enough. They are good enough because many of those players who played in those clubs are the ones now playing in the African clubs, are now the one playing in the European clubs. So if they can play in the African club and successfully play in the European club, why is it that African nations don't develop the clubs in Africa, the football clubs in Africa, and develop the players in Africa so they could play in Africa and stay in Africa? Wouldn't have to travel, find a way to come and play in the European clubs. African leaders, I'm happy that the European clubs are saying no. I hope next time all the European clubs should say no. That will make the African nation to start developing their own players and making sure their players play in Africa and stay in Africa so that they can be utilized to play in the African club or in the African um, Nations Cup or in the World Cup when it is needed. Time, effort, money, resources. Africa needs to put that in their players so that when they do that, their players will not have to go to Europe to play. Whenever they need them to play in the African Nations Cup or in the World Cup, they are available. And they will also have the opportunity to say no to these European clubs when they come to try to buy the African players or try to take the African players to come and play in their club. It's because, Africa is not doing the work. There are certain countries in Africa that are doing the work. Countries like Egypt, they have really good clubs in Egypt. Most of the players play in Egypt, stay in Egypt. Most of the players don't come out. Most of the players stay in Egypt. Some of them do, but most of them stay in Egypt. So Egypt will not have to run to the European club to ask for their players to come and play because they already have enough players in the nation to select them and play in the African club and the African nation cups or in the world cups. You see, Africa has to rethink. African leadership have to also rethink how to do things. They have, if you look at it for the past 10, 20 years, maybe African nations have been depending on European clubs by allowing the players to play in the European clubs, whereby they use them to play in the African Nations Cups or in the World Cup, instead of them developing their players in their own respective countries, so that whenever they need them to play the African Nations Cup or the World Cup, they are available. But since they're not doing that, whenever they need them, they're always going to ask by the European clubs. Now the European clubs are saying no. They should all say no. All the European clubs who have African players playing in their team, they should all say no to Africa. Whenever they need the players come and play, the African Nations Cup or World Cup, they should say no. Because they're not spending the time, they're not spending the effort, they're not putting the financial resources to develop the players in Africa to play in Africa. They're not doing that. If Africa could start doing that, and actually, they could actually create a whole different franchise in making money, not just waiting to play the African Union or African Nation Cup or World Cup. You could also have 5 regional cups: the East Africa Cup, the West Africa Cup, the Central African Cup. Those are countries in those regions playing. That's another method to bring in money in those region and to put players from those region to play in those clubs if you do create them in Africa. Those are businesses that African could do. Create regional um, soccer conferences or regional football conferences in the continent of Africa, where it's not going to only depend on a specific. Because if you look at how Africa is divided, you got basically um, 5 gigantic countries in Africa. Nigeria is, the giant of Africa, so that's number one. You have Egypt, which is the biggest one. It's also a big country in Africa. You know, in Northern Africa, it's big. It's a big country. In Southern Africa, you have South Africa. That's a big nation. They should have they could have multiple clubs in South Africa, and I'm quite sure they do have, where they don't really you know need to be part of the region. But then again, if you make it regional wise, create soccer teams or soccer conferences region wise, you also help develop soccer players that you need to play in the African Nations Cup or in the World Cup. That's a good idea to do. But then again, most of the great African players are developed in European clubs, not in African clubs. Yeah, they get their foot start in Africa, but they develop their soccer skills well in their prime in the European clubs. That is something that Africa need to disconnect. And by doing that, they'll groom the players in the continent of Africa, whereby they won't have to go to Europe or any other countries out of Africa to play. They will be able to play in the continent of Africa. But it always saying that um, if he was the president of the federation, he could prevent these players from participating in their football club. Samuel Eto'o made his money in European clubs. He didn't make his money in Africa. So if you decide to say, oh, if he was as I say, if he was the president of the federation, um, in Africa, he'll prevent players from playing in European clubs. But if they don't play in European clubs, where can they make money? Where can they make money? They won't be able to make money because you have the Nations Cups every 2 years. You have the um, uh, World Football every 4 years. And then in Africa, very few countries like South Africa, they could have a really solid um, club league. Countries like Nigeria, since it's a gigantic country, could also have a very solid club league. Countries like Congo, which is a big country, despite the fact they have many war going on or whatever, based on their size, they could also have a good soccer, football club league or whatever. And then you have Egypt, but they're certain countries in Africa, even though they are smaller, they still have good football. Like the key is for Africa to develop that African club league where the African players will play in the continent and make money in the continent. Because they cannot make money in the continent, even a player like Samuel Eto'o had to make money outside of the continent. He didn't make his money in Africa. So there's no way you could say, oh, let's prevent the African players from not playing, you know, in European club where that's where they have the chance to make their money. If you want to do that, if you want to prevent players from playing in European clubs, then give them the opportunity to play in clubs in Africa where they can make money when they're not playing in the African Nations Cups or World Cup. You see, you're saying this, but you're not giving solutions. You're not providing solution by the statement that Samuel Eto'o made. In just preventing them from not playing in clubs because the European clubs can prevent the players from playing in the African Nations Cup because While if they decide to go and play in the African Nations Cup, then they won't have a chance an opportunity to play in the European club, and they'll lose finances, they'll lose money. Right, like it or not, it's all about making money. Players who are really good and are making money, why would you think they want to play in you know in Nations Cup when they will lose money in the club that they were playing, and then after the Nations Cup they will be playing to make money? It's not all about you know nation spirit. No, people gotta survive, and if you're not giving them people with the skills that they have to survive, they'll have to survive somehow. So I like the fact that the European clubs are refusing African players to go and to allow them to play in their nation's team. You know, more of the more of the European clubs should do that. That way, it would force Africa to develop the um, clubs that are needed to sponsor the players that they want to play in the African nations or World Cup. If they don't do that, right? How do you expect people to survive? Hmm. I like the fact, simple. I just like the fact that the European clubs are refusing African from leaving to go and play in their own nations. It is good because it's teaching Africa to wise up, or fuck up. This is King H.